You guys want to come up with me? Yeah. Thanks, George. Yeah, we have a number of our podcast folks here tonight from the Water Under Pressure series, and I do want to take a moment to thank them and appreciate them for spending a significant amount of time with myself and the team, sharing their stories, opening up to us. I think I have slides here. I got to turn this on, though. You've probably seen these out front. And if you were part of the Water Under Pressure podcast and you're here, if you would mind standing up for just a second so we can recognize and thank you. See Jesus and Brian and Cindy. Yes, thank you. Emma's here. Thank you. My cousin and my uncle's here. They took so many damn questions from me. Thank you all. All the questions I was embarrassed to ask smart people and people in the Valley. I was like, wait, can you tell me what this means? And so they would do that for me. So thank you to them for being here tonight. George, thank you as well for founding the Institute for Science and Policy and supporting us for these years. It's an absolute joy to come and work on the subjects that we get to work on every day. I feel very, very lucky for that. And get to tell stories. That's kind of what we're doing. Our symposium this year was Living with Uncertainty. You all saw that slide. And it's a pretty big topic. When you think about uncertainty, I've talked with a lot of people throughout the year about that. And it's been fascinating to hear all the different responses. And I often think people come down very much to the individual personal response of how they think about and react and respond to uncertainty. Because it's through nature, it's inherent, it's in every moment of our lives. But how we approach it and think about it is really relevant to how we then approach and think about the world. So we've been spending a lot of time today talking about scientific uncertainty as we make decisions, and how can we navigate that a little bit better in a very uncertain world and future. And tonight we're going to kind of dive into specifically water. And so it's a great opportunity to blend what we've been doing and talking about with this podcast, with our symposium theme. So we've kind of got this awesome mixed audience here tonight, people who from our symposium and then people from our podcast to talk about water. So I'm Kristan. I'm the director of the Institute. I have 3 stellar people next to me who, if anything, we're going to have to keep the mic out of their hands because they have amazing stories to tell. Very important characters to our story. I am so grateful to all 3 of you for sharing your time with me, being very welcoming to the Valley, going really deep with me and the law and the policy world and telling me all your personal stories. And Cleave, I remember the very first time we met here wasn't very recently, and just since then it's been great to get to know you over this time. Thank you for your leadership in our state. So Senator Cleave Simpson, he represents the San Luis Valley, as well as many, many areas here in Colorado. Sitting right next to him is James Eklund. He is an attorney. He was the lead author of our Colorado First Water Plan, for those of you who are familiar with that. He pretty much is a little bit of a water czar in our state. I'll give you that title. So he knows a lot in the policy and law. And directly next to me is Heather Dutton, who's the manager for the San Luis Valley Water Conservation District, and was pretty much the first person who welcomed us there and just opened up so many connections and doors to people in the Valley. So thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a Q&A here. We're going to talk through a lot of different themes tonight, and you all will get to engage in questions for my panelists, so don't worry. You're not just going to sit here and listen all night. We'll get you a chance to ask questions. But maybe all of our panelists just take a minute or two, talk to our audience a little bit about how you came to work in water. Like, what's your background? What are you doing? And how did this happen? And we're just going to run right down here.
Thanks. Yeah, so I guess the story I tell, which I think, growing up in the San Luis Valley, we tend to be connected to water early on. And so I can remember, going and never successfully, but trying to pull siphon tubes and, being always on the farm or with my family going on picnics by rivers. And so my love for water was pretty big early on. But I think how I came to actually work in water, really, it comes back to a phone call I had with my dad when I was up at CSU and I was studying natural resources management, and I had just found out there was a restoration ecology program, and I called him and I was like, hey, there's this program, and I could major in it, and then maybe I could do river restoration and work on putting ecosystems back together. And he was like, yeah, you should do it and come back and work for the restoration project. And so that's what I did. And so I think, yeah, that's, I graduated with a degree in restoration ecology from CSU, went back and got a master's, but effectively started working in 2009 for the Rio Grande Headwaters Restoration Project, and then that catapulted me into working for the district. And so I feel like I got kind of lucky to get to land where I wanted to.
Yeah, and everything, I want you to take this off for me if that's okay. Half of the people we interviewed are from CSU alums. It was just a reoccurring theme here. James, share with us a little bit about your history and story and how you got here.
Okay, James Eklund, and it's just it's a treat to be here. My wife and my son are here, and we basically raised our kids in this museum. So it's just a wonderful, wonderful place. It's a crown jewel, really, of not just the city but the state. And to get here to have to, they have to hear from me in full surround sound what they hear at the dinner table every night. So I'll beg their indulgence early, but my story starts, I think everything comes back to the Valley in one way, shape, or form. My great-great-grandmother on my mom's side, different is on my grandmother's parents, came in to Colorado through the San Luis Valley and worked for General Palmer in Colorado Springs, and then ultimately met and joined up with the rest of my grandparents over on the Western Slope. But everything kind of starts in the Valley for me because of that kind of familial connection, but also so our ranch is on the Western Slope of Colorado on the north side of Grand Mesa, and it was homesteaded there in 1888 by Norwegian immigrants escaping a depression back in Europe in that era. And we have operated it ever since, but how I've come to this position to be talking with you today is because Ken Salazar, also from the Valley, let me be his driver when he was running for re-election as an attorney general. I wasn't qualified to do anything else, so that's what I got to do. And he talked to me because cell phone technology was terrible. If you've heard the podcast, you heard me kind of tell about that. But that was kind of a progression that he set in motion for me that got me into water law and policy, and it has been a professional love affair of mine since that conversation took place. So that's kind of what's gotten me to this place, and I get to practice water law with some really remarkable Coloradans today at the oldest law firm in Colorado, Sherman Howard. So that's probably more than you wanted, but.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
2 minutes, Cleave says. Senator, what's your story?
Thanks, Kristan. Well, likewise, it's such an honor and privilege to be here, to sit on this panel with folks that I've come to work with and respect over the last several years. It really is a special moment for me. I was born and raised in Alamos in the San Luis Valley, so it's getting even more unique to be a true native Coloradan. And I grew up on a farm and a ranch. I'm the fourth generation of my family to farm and ranch in the San Luis Valley, and I tell people that it feels like a big deal in this audience, but if I'm in the San Luis Valley and say that, I'll get laughed out of the room, because the Salazar family, there are many of them that are 6, 7, and 8 generations, but I grew up on an irrigated farm, and much like Heather, was throwing siphon tubes and a shovel and a canvas dam my entire young life. Was fortunate enough to go to school of mines and get an engineering degree and leave for a while, but was drawn back home, and really have always had this kind of informal connection with water as being in irrigated agriculture, but was fortunate enough to become the general manager of the Rio Grande Water Conservation District in 2016, and that really started me down this path of kind of where I'm at today, where opportunity to run for a state Senate seat, knowing how important water was going to be, to the state, and how we, if we're not really careful and thoughtful about this, you run the risk of really fundamentally changing what Colorado, in particular rural Colorado, looks like, given the water challenges. So it's got me here again, still the manager of the Rio Grande Water Conservation District and representing the fine constituents in Senate District 35 for another month, and then because of redistricting, I'll represent Senate District 6. But that's that's a whole nother conversation and story. But it's again an honor and privilege to be here and amongst these folks. It's a great opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, when we were thinking about how do we credit Senator Cleave Simpson as we're trying to release the podcast right around election time and all this great stuff, we're like, we're just going to roll with Senate District 35 for right now. So we're going to try to stay somewhat on theme and topic, which is around uncertainty in water, but that's going to take a lot of different flavors. But I want to keep it pretty open and broad here to start and just kind of toss it back to you all, have the three of you just start sharing some thoughts. When you think about uncertainty when it comes to water, whether that's through management or whether that's through policy or whether that's just your individual actions, like give me a thought or two when you think about that uncertain future and water within it. And I will just look to see who wants to go first. I see a sigh, so I've got to take her.
Man, there's such an abundance of uncertainty, particularly, being born and raised in the San Luis Valley in the Rio Grande Basin. I really kind of highlight is it's probably like a decade in front of what, the Colorado River is getting an abundance of notoriety and press about the challenges there, but really what we've experienced in the San Luis Valley and the Rio Grande Basin has really been kind of a precursor to what's unfolding today in the Colorado River system, where, it's really a function of dwindling supplies and kind of ever-increasing demands. And how do you, in our communities where Heather and I live, those economies, culture, and communities are really all built around irrigated agriculture from a water supply from 100 years ago that's not anywhere close to the same. So our community really has tried to step up and be in that active space of trying to figure out in this day of uncertainty. And for us, it's very measurable and reported about. We depend on groundwater supplies, aquifer systems that are really under tremendous stress. And so we report on the condition of our aquifers monthly, really since 1976. And it's really apparent since 2002, the worst drought in our recorded history, the condition and the continued decline in the supply in our aquifer systems, and to watch our community really try to come together and figure out a path forward that doesn't completely wreck our communities and economies has been an interesting, I refuse to call it an experiment. It's not truly an experiment. It's a necessity that we have to do this. So we've learned, again, over the last really 20 years, this high level of uncertainty and trying to figure out how do you survive in this age, in this day and age. And it's not been easy, and we'll get to dig in a little bit more about how challenging that is. And again, you can take that and replicate what we've been doing in the Rio Grande Basin across Colorado. You see those discussions unfolding today and over the last couple of years.
When you hear uncertainty and groundwater, I think of cones. There's the cone of uncertainty, and then there's the cone of depression. And it's not like the depression like you're sad. It's the depression like when you sink a well, it creates a cone of depression that the water kind of runs into. But the reason I was thinking of that when you were asking the question and Cleave's answer is that we have just an abundance of science and data, more than we've ever had in human history, that it's accessible to us. We can run analytics on it. It's really a remarkable time to be in the water management business. And at the same time, we still have so much to learn about how groundwater in the valley behaves and how we're best to manage it, what lessons we can learn from the valley in the Colorado River Basin, because the Senator is exactly right. You guys are living with the precursor to scarcity, that you found a way to abide by your interstate compacts and really administer water pursuant to those requirements. And the Colorado River's never had to deal with that. So you've also had interstate litigation with Texas and New Mexico and Colorado on the river. And again, Colorado has never been involved in litigation on the Colorado River. So it's really important for us to look to the Arkansas and the Rio Grande when we look at best management practices in administering the water. Because that's the crazy thing. We're in your state, your beautiful state, is the headwaters to 18 downstream states and Mexico. That means that everyone's watching us. And there's not, the only other state with this dynamic is Hawaii, where you have every single one of your rivers leaving your state, never to return. So we've got a lot of people watching what we do. And for us to learn from the folks in our own state that have gone through those challenges is just incredibly important.
Yeah, I think it's a neat thing to be on the panel with you guys and to, the work that you've done around the state, and to think about how the three of us get to have the foot in our communities, but then also the foot at the state level, and to see, exactly what you're talking about, James, where the Valley has been or is an example of what can and might and probably will happen in other areas. And so it's fascinating, I think, for those of us in the Valley to see, where could we have done better? You mentioned there hasn't been compact litigation or a compact call on the Colorado River, but the Rio Grande Basin has been dealing with curtailment since 1968. We've been, so we're not new to this. We've been working with our neighbors on administering a compact and learning how to live with less to hold up our end of this legal bargain. And so I think that's where it's such a fascinating thing to live through, and I feel like maybe we should start keeping journals instead of just talking about it over beer sometimes, because it's, we're living with we know what it's like to be cut back and to have to figure out how to live within our means, but yet we haven't quite done it. We're still struggling to balance our water use with our water demand in the Rio Grande Basin, and so that's where it's, when I'm at state meetings, I want to tell people we have a lot of don'ts that we've learned that we would like to share with other people, but we sure would like to hear some do's from everyone else, because we're still figuring it out. And I think something that was kind of striking me on the way up here, I was thinking about this question of how do we deal with uncertainty personally. And for the district that I manage, I try to hope for the best and plan for the worst. And the worst on record was 2002. And so if the San Luis Valley Water Conservancy District's water supplies are what they were in 2002, it's pretty rough. And that's what I try to plan for, that every next year is going to be a 2002. And when it's not, we're like, whew, it wasn't the worst. But I got to realize just how maybe hard things have become, because the best in my mind is average. We're just hoping for average. And the average on the Rio Grande has dropped in the last 2 decades by 15%. If we just look at the last 20 years, the average of those 20 years is 15% less than the average since 1890. And so we're seeing these tremendous losses in the amount of water in our rivers in a very short amount of time. And I think that's the kind of stuff that really stresses all of us out, is how do we deal with that uncertainty of what we're going to get next year or in 10 years, and how do we meet this demand where there are more people and less water?
Let's stick with that.
I think about, dealing with uncertainty, individually. And again, I referenced the 4th generation of my family. Well, I have a 31-year-old son who is the 5th generation, who should be home taking care of my farm and ranch while I'm up here, and he does a good job. And I have a 2-year-old grandson that could be the 6th generation of my family to do this. But that the uncertainty just continues to build, particularly for Heather and I, where we live. We live in the driest spot in the state of Colorado. The valley floor gets 7 inches of precipitation a year, but yet again we have this prolific agricultural industry that relies on irrigation, surface water out of the river systems and groundwater. But I raise alfalfa, the most water consumptive use crop we could raise. But that's what my dad did, my grandpa did, my great-grandpa did. That's where all my capital investment was to do that. But this trying to deal with uncertainty has my son and I now talking about, I don't know that I can keep doing what we've been doing for decades. There's not probably a water supply. So it's this, I know it's a little cliche, but this holistic approach about soil health and different crops and even energy sufficiency. So we're in this space of really trying to think about this high level of uncertainty and go, if we really want to continue to be here and be productive, and have an amazing ag community in the San Luis Valley, we really got to start thinking a little differently. And I think about the hundreds of constituents that I have that are going through this same kind of evaluation to go, this is getting harder and harder all the time. And if we don't start thinking about this a little bit differently, again, you run the risk, internally we run the risk of really fundamentally changing what our communities look like. So it's I think about uncertainty all across the state too. I get focused in the Rio Grande, but you don't have to look far. The South Platte, the Republican River, the Arkansas, the Rio Grande, and the Colorado River, we're all dealing with this high level, really kind of ultra, it's not paranoid, but this effort of this huge amount of uncertainty just bearing down on us like this giant freight train.
What's in addition to that is, you get you're going to have to cut us off on
No,
this.
I was going to say,
stuff.
we're just going to let them run this themselves. I'm totally fine with it. They're great. Keep
Well,
going.
when you sit on a panel with the senator and Heather, it's you start thinking of things on the fly a lot, and
Makes my job easier.
yeah. So when you talk about the uncertainty literally on the ground, you're talking about soil moisture and management and all of the crop choice and all of that. You've got that on one end of the spectrum, and then on the other, you have a vast amount of uncertainty. Geopolitics plays into this. I mean, if you look at the war in Ukraine, what did that do? Well, it cut off wheat supply for Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Europe. Fossil fuel fertilizers out of Belarus and Ukraine are no longer available to grow crops if you're not getting the wheat from those regions. And what's that do to global economic, global economics, but agronomics, where you've got the vast majority of China's food is imported into China. American agriculture is going to be in a dominant role in the coming decades. And at the same time we're entering that role that we are going to have to play in growing the food for more and more of the world's population, we're also entering this era where we don't have the water, or we're telling the agricultural sector writ large that, well, your use isn't as important as other uses. So we need to take that offline, and we need to put that water into industry or municipal use. And that's going to be a really difficult part of the uncertainty puzzle that we're going to have to figure out.
So I want to pick up on maybe a couple different themes, but I'm going to start one. I want to think about it through that lens of decision making specifically. And one of our conversations earlier today, I'm going to pull this idea from the RAND Corporation and the idea of brittle decisions, where if you don't really focus in on identifying values in your processes collectively across stakeholder groups before you get to making decisions, you can get past that decision and that decision starts to break apart because you either didn't have a thoughtful process, you really didn't align around values, or you didn't quite understand what those future conditions could be like, even though those future conditions could change. And so your decision feels very brittle is the word that they were using. And that latched on to me of like, how do we not make brittle decisions? How do we think about this process that I've heard a few of you talk about, like, hey, what are we doing here in the Valley and how can this be translated to other parts of the state? So think to me a little bit about that idea of aligning around values and a thoughtful process with the encapsulation of it being uncertain at times to ultimately try to make some thoughtful decisions. You all have very much a strong foothold in that decision-making space. It was a little bit of a wonky topic. I'm super sorry I went there, but I've got a panel to take me there, and I think you want to start.
Well, so
And finish.
Brittle decisions. I've got a good story, and then I'll. So, in 1972, 1973, we had Silent Spring. The environmental awakening was happening. We had the Clean Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act. The Endangered Species Act. We, as a nation, started to look at our policy as like, well, we got to take care of the environment. We've got to make sure that that's addressed. And a lot of the agencies around the federal government didn't know what to do with that. And it was the chief one being the Bureau of Reclamation. Their job was to build reservoir storage around the West. And they looked at this new raft of legislation as being somewhat threatening to their pipeline of ability to build water projects around the West. And so they commissioned each Western state to come up with a water plan. And they asked everybody, Colorado included, come up with a water plan. And what we mean by that is develop a list of projects that you want us to build. And then when push comes to shove in Congress or the Appropriations Committee, we'll have a list we can go to, and that'll be kind of our answer to all this. Well, the states got that directive, and in Colorado, this is under Governor Lamb, Chips Berry, the former head of Denver Water, was the Department of Natural Resources director at the time, and he was tasked with going out and making sure we do this work that the Bureau of Reclamation asked us to do. Well, you're setting up a brittle decision that is liable to collapse when you do what we really have a hard time avoiding, which is putting really smart people in a room in Denver and cooking up a policy, a cake, if you will, a policy cake, and then taking it out, taking that policy cake out, Heather, to the rest of the state and saying, will you please eat this? And please tell us how good it is. And that's what we did. And so I had to go to the bowels of the CU Law Library to find a copy, because I think they were burned everywhere else, of the state water plan from 1973-74. And I found it. And it was paper, it was very thin because it was a reconnaissance level. It was a really poorly made cake. It was a brittle decision. And it didn't produce anything. And so we had a lesson in what not to do when we started the water planning process. We had these basin roundtables. These two folks, instrumental in the roundtable that has existed ever since the formation of those roundtables came online and in the valley. And because of that, we reversed the entire flow of that decision-making process. Instead of having the geniuses in Denver, the cooks in the kitchen, come to Denver and make the cake here, we had every single one of the basins make their own slice of the cake. And then it was our job at the state to bring those pieces together into something you would recognize as a cake. And I'm torturing this analogy.
Very much so, yeah.
You've done this before for me, James.
But I'm
well
not
down the
stopping.
path. You're
I'm
well
not
down the
stopping.
path.
It's
Keep
never
going.
stopped me before. You throw it all together, and it's lo and behold the most wonderful cake that ever existed. And that's
like a
what we did
wedding
in
cake.
2015. So that's my little story about brittle decision making.
So brittle, and others chime in on whether brittle decisions, you've seen them fall apart, or there's something that you think it works well to not make these decisions so potentially brittle when future conditions change that they fall apart.
I have a thought, but do you want to go?
I'll let you go.
I was just thinking about, there's probably, I think you're referencing, and James's example is very intentional, brittle decisions. I think about what's kind of occurred in the San Luis Valley, where it may have ended up being a brittle decision, but it wasn't intentional. It was very much structured. I think of what a group of our constituents in the San Luis Valley that represent about 170,000 acres that depends on this shallow, unconfined aquifer in the basin. And we've monitored the change in this aquifer monthly since January of 1976. And in 2002, the worst drought in our recorded history, the aquifer took a precipitous decline. And that really was a motivation for the constituents there to come together and go, if we aren't really thoughtful about how we manage this aquifer, we're just going to pump it to the bottom, and we'll just see who's the last one left with the most money or the deepest well. So very intentional. We structured over the course of a couple of years a plan of water management for managing that aquifer, and ended up being statutorily required of us to create and maintain sustainable aquifers. But it started very much as self-preservation. And I think of all the effort that went into that groundwater management and the ideas and the policies that were crafted around that were very well intentioned, but we're 10 years into operating under that, and we're in the midst of now our 4th amended plan. Again, very intentional to have engagement, 2 years now of working with producers and constituents about how do you structure this, because the plan and the decisions we built, a decade ago, we never envisioned that we would be 20 years into the kind of drought conditions and the aridification that we see now. So the idea when they constructed it was, look, when they envisioned this in 2004 and 6 was like, if the next 20 years look like the last 20 years at that time, our plan, our policies, our decisions would have recovered the aquifer. But we didn't have that, foresight to know that the next 20 years were actually going to be the worst 20 years in 1,200 years of recorded history. So I was thinking about that in terms of kind of very intentional and very unintentional, brittle circumstances, decisions, but
I want you to add
policy cake, so I got to take that to the Capitol with me.
policy cakes. You're going to take it. I want you to respond, but I want to follow up real quick with this. And Cleave, Senator, did you have a reflection on something that you think should be done differently, like from that process?
Well, the short answer is really no. Again, people were making the best decisions they had with the information available to them at the time, and it's really frustrating to think now 10 years and $70 million of collection of assessments of those constituents inside that sub-district. You can look at the condition of the aquifer today, and this is after taking 1/3 of the pumping out of the sub-district, 100,000 acre-feet of pumping out. The aquifer today is nearly at its lowest point ever since we started recording it in January of 1976, after all that effort. So that part of it just, is, I don't know what we would have done different 12 years ago, but the group just continues to meet and engage and try to build something, again, that preserves as best we can, preserves our way of life. So it's pretty challenging.
I don't think I have an example of a brittle decision. I'm going to have to ruminate on that one. I am amused sitting here on this stage and being with the engineer talking about the data, the attorney talking about going in the bowels of the legal library, and now the
He's
ecologist.
actually a baker.
The ecologist, I'll talk about system. I feel like we're a bad joke.
Yeah.
Like walk into the bar. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think I can think of an example of a really non-brittle or maybe rubbery, a very nice spongy decision that was made. And I go back to, in the late 90s, a great example is when the people of the San Luis Valley recognized that the river wasn't functioning, the Rio Grande wasn't functioning how it had historically. And so they took a real holistic approach and they got funding from the Colorado Water Conservation Board. The San Luis Valley Water Conservancy District led this study of the river where they looked at everything. They looked at the physical things in the river, like bridges and diversion dams and all this other stuff. They looked at the condition of the floodplain, riparian areas, fish habitat. They even talked about how well are we educating the public on water use and the importance of the river. And then the district formed the Rio Grande Headwaters Restoration Project to implement the study. And since then, there have been more studies and stream management plans. But it's incredible to me to look back on that and to say that I think the reason that study, it's not on a shelf. It's still being used. It's still really relevant. And again, we've gathered more data to make sure that we know the current condition and we're not just using the 20-year-old condition. But the issues in that study still stand and provide a really good example for the community to move forward to improve the health of the river. And I think the reason it was so effective is because the people who were in charge, and there was a gentleman named Brian Hyde with the CWCB who can kind of single-handedly be credited for the success of the study because he made sure there was really good attendance at the meetings and that there really were environmental groups, agriculture groups, agency people, private landowners, all these different people were represented. And I think that's, and not just the people, but thinking about how we fit. James talked about this water plan being reclamation. And we used to think of a water plan as taming the natural menace of rivers. And the thing that the study did that was so beautiful was the people thought about how they fit within the ecosystem. And I think that's what we have to do, that as we have more uncertainty and as conditions change, as if we're thinking about how we're part of this and not in charge of it or separate from these big ecosystems, I think we're setting ourselves up to be more resilient.
That's wonderful. Okay, I'm going to do this because I often forget to do this, and we actually have intention. I absolutely want to hear questions and work some of your thoughts and questions into this conversation. QR code, website, you can put your questions in here. You can upvote good questions. So if you have this is a competition. So if you have a good question, you can upvote it, and guess what? The top votes are going to probably make it their way to me here. But I want to hear your questions for the panel because I've got a list and I could run this all night. But feel free to engage in us in some conversation here virtually. I think maybe we'll do like another 20 or 30 minutes with you. Do you have something to say about this competition?
No.
I love a good competition. So I actually want to pick up on another theme that kind of got brought up just a little bit earlier, but also, Senator, something that you're going to ask your own question. Go for it. Okay. Senator, when we were interviewing for the podcast, you talked a little bit about transformational change. And you kind of brought that back up a little bit here earlier this evening, and how, perhaps what things are happening are not transformational enough. And you start questioning not only your own behaviors and actions, but those around you, and thinking about transformational change that needs to happen, right? But that change is hard at the individual level. We know this, that's human nature. It is really hard from going from a way of life to a different way of life. And now we layer in this idea of what I've heard all three of you talk about, which is some of the scarcity and the fear and these things that come with the unknown, with uncertainty. So, give me some inspiration about this idea of if we need transformational change to be happening, but it's not happening because of all these various factors. What does that look like, either for you personally or for some of your neighbors? And then I want you all to please take this as well, too.
Well, it's a pretty difficult kind of conversation, but it is something ingrained. I touched on it. My son and I, he's 31, and this year we raised 50 acres of hemp, but we raised industrial hemp just for the fiber. We didn't try to process CBD oil. We didn't do CBD oil or the seed. It was really just 50 acres, cut it for fiber. It's baled in a round bale sitting in the yard right now to be processed. But it's part of this kind of evaluation change is going to happen. One way or the other, I believe change is going to happen to us. So you can either be active in the space to try to manage it to some degree. Again, I don't think I can keep raising 800 acres of irrigated alfalfa and selling it for a premium to dairies in New Mexico, which is what we've done forever, and our cows as well. And again, trying to think, it's a little cliche, but more sustainably. How can I structure this for my son and my grandson to have an opportunity? And I think my community is broadly focused in that space about we can do some things in the Rio Grande Basin. Again, I highlight it as kind of the poster child for what can happen across the rest of the state. I know these conversations are happening elsewhere, but we can gain a little bit around some irrigation efficiencies. I touched on when I was a kid, all we did was flood irrigation. When I was a senior in high school getting ready to college, my dad put up his first center pivot sprinkler system. Imagine that. And he didn't have to chase water around with a shovel and canvas dams and siphon tubes. But the technology continues to improve in this space where we can get a little better around irrigation efficiencies and close the gap a little bit, but it's not going to solve our problem. I talk about us, my farm and my family, thinking about raising some different crops that aren't so water consumptive. But I live at 8,000 foot of elevation where you can have a killing frost, and we've had killing frosts every month out of the year. So we don't have a whole laundry list of different kind of crops we can grow, but we're trying to work in that space to see what else we can do here and still be a viable economic community. But ultimately for me, there's this recognition we're going to have less irrigated acres. what, you know, and how do we get less irrigated acres because we can't recover our aquifer like we're statutorily required to do? And the state engineer tells us we can't operate this year, and there's 170,000 acres with, you know, really kind of one swipe of the pen that's not functioning for 1 year? Or do we be very thoughtful about it, and can we find places, and historically we've been trying to do this through voluntary, not temporary, but compensated reduction in irrigated acres. So I feel like I'm rambling, but you're faced with this again. I heard somebody reference this is like the slowest moving freight train ever. If you can't figure out how to get out of the way of this freight train, shame on you. But if you do nothing, the freight train's going to run over us for sure.
Yeah, I don't know, the phrase that comes to mind when I hear the senator talk is stationarity is dead. You've heard that. You probably talked about it during some of the events today. You know, on our place, we always tell the story of our great-great-grandparents rolling into the Plateau Valley, and there were still Indian teepee poles standing on the property when they showed up. And that's really a powerful thing to think about, because they weren't just managing the land and stewarding the water for the generation that was there. They were doing it for 4, 5, 6 generations down the line. And if you do that kind of, if you think about the next generation, like the senator said, and maybe even the generation past that, it's a totally different mindset about the decisions that you make on a daily basis, whether it's about inputs into your operation, what you're growing, transportation of what you're growing to market. It's really living in kind of harmony with the system that you've inherited than trying to wrestle it into submission. And I think that's from the ecologist is always going to laugh at that. But yeah, I'm the same way. My grandfather and his father before him and his father before him did flood irrigation, raised a certain genetic type of cow that, and the feed and all of that was very rote and had to be followed by the next generation in order for the margins to work. And we're getting to a place where we need the agricultural producer, large and small, to be given the flexibility, have the flexibility to make some transitions that the economics wouldn't otherwise recommend they do. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for us to change to a different crop type or put in a cover crop or go to a regenerative grazing pattern if we know we're going to take it in the teeth for the next couple of years doing that, because we need that to make the margin work. We've got to have enough flexibility, enough of a buffer to allow us to make those transitions. And I think using water as a catalyst to provide that flexibility is a really interesting opportunity.
Yeah, I think when I think about this wild transformation that we need to have, and really it's, if we're going, I mean, the people that are going to be left standing are the ones that were able to adapt. That was something that was said at an ag conference last year, that if someone goes out of business, it's not because the sub-district charged them so much. It's because these people failed to learn to live within the new reality. And I think about transformation happening in this state, definitely agree with everything that Cleave and James are saying, and this lens through agriculture. But I think it's everyone. We as a state need to transform. We need to think about, everyone in this room, we all have to collectively think about how we use water. And if you're a municipal water user, Are you irrigating turf that you only walk on when you mow it? You know, that kind of non-functional turf. What about those decisions? And how are we thinking about top to bottom? And I think my dream for us is that we all transform into this beautiful butterfly where we as a state have this shared ethic where we see the value of water for what it really is, and we understand just how precious and how scarce it is. And I don't see that yet. I still see places where, you know, we're still learning and we're still trying, but I think that would be my vision, is that, you know, ag uses, you know, ag uses the most water in the state, and as you discuss in the podcast, that it's like that the context of that statement is pretty loaded because so much water gets reused. You know, Jim Yon talks about how the South Platte is the river of reuse. How many times? I think it's 10 times the water gets pulled out, irrigated, brought back into the South Platte before it reaches the state line. And so, you know, to say that ag uses more water, well, yeah, but they use it they use it really well. There's wildlife habitat. There are all these other things that we value that are tied to that ag. And so yeah, we need to see transformation across the board, but it's this incremental change too. Every single drop, that if we can all think about, you know, how we're landscaping, how we're valuing, what kind of food we're eating, you know, supporting, really lifting up the people who are the good examples. As these guys were talking about, you know, their vision for ag, I was thinking about individual people I know around the state who are these great examples. And I think this is a really exciting time to talk about transformation and this big opportunity, because with all of this money that's coming in with the infrastructure bills and, you know, funding at the state level, we have this huge opportunity to work on the efficiency of our infrastructure, but to also make examples of people, the people that are doing really good work, to help fund expanding that work and scaling it up. And so I'm really excited about it, and I think we are going to see some transformation, and I hope, I'm challenging all of you to think about ways that, you know, we can collectively think about it and think about being part of the solution, because we can't just point fingers at each other. We have to own our own role in this big water picture.
I was going to add, that was interesting, and Heather brings up a good point about, you know, transforming across the board and the spectrum. And I think about last session was asked to sponsor a bill, a turf buyback bill, where we put $4 million into a program to help municipalities either expand their existing turf buyback program or set one up. So Western Resources Advocacy worked with me as one of the Senate sponsors to do that. And honestly, it was like a feel-good bill to me. I don't know how impactful this is going to be, but it just amazed me when the bill passed. My office was flooded and continues to be flooded with people calling and asking, how do I participate? So I do think we're kind of at this unique nexus, this point in time where people are understanding where you live. You live in the arid West, and that supply of water, well, a lot of it has to do with the Colorado River system. Hardly a day goes by that you don't pick up a paper or see a report about the water levels in Lake Powell or Lake Mead, and it really starts to strike a chord. And again, this is something Heather and I deal with in the Rio Grande Basin for more than a decade. So it's frustrating, but it's also encouraging to know that people are grasping onto this really set of challenging circumstances we all live in and experience. Certainly, you know, being born in Alamosa and growing up and driving to Denver, I'm certainly more sensitive today driving by and looking at turf in medians or look, I play a little golf, but seeing golf courses and go, we're actually drying up, you know, we're drying up farms in the San Luis Valley because there's just not enough water supply. And so it's like, how do you help, you know, spread the word? And we all participate in this kind of effort that's unfolding before our eyes.
I think I've been hearing brown is the new green. Have you all been hearing that here in the arid West? This like lines and slogans. I have so much to talk about. Unfortunately, I'm going to actually bring in some of your all's questions. I will stop being selfish and hogging your all's times. And obviously, we talked a little bit about the major drought that's currently experiencing our state. Aridification was a term that Senator Cleave brought up, which is a newer term that's being circulated. It's about both warming and drying and the combination of the two and how that's exacerbating droughts. So obviously we have a question here that many people want to ask about, which is that the impact of climate change and climate projections. How does that factor into your thinking when you think about uncertainty in the water space and the decisions you have to make? How does that climate conversation fit in?
I can
Go.
take that. I mean, thinking about transforming the way that we use water, I think we also have to transform the way we talk about water. And that's been, it's been kind of a soapbox that I'm on, but it's been really neat to see, especially with the Colorado Water Conservation Board updating the water plan. So we'll have the second Colorado water plan here in January. And that was a really big effort to push away from talking about drought and talk about aridification, because what we're in, someone even said it on the podcast. They talked about how, we're in this drought and we haven't gotten out of it, and that there's this implication that drought is temporary. And I think that especially, with the drought hitting the agriculture community so hard, people are not in ag if they're not optimistic. They're always, and I think water managers are the same way. Like I said, I'm always hoping that the next big year is going to be great, and I'm a backcountry snowmobiler, so I want big, deep snow. But we are seeing that we're not getting that kind of supply, and the projections and all the data around climate change are showing us that it's not going to get better. And so by saying drought, I think we're still providing a little bit of that hope that things are going to go back to normal, and I think that's probably prolonging some of these harder decisions from being made, because we're just kind of like, yeah, but it'll go back. It'll be like it was. It'll be like the 80s. They were awesome for so many reasons, like hair and things. I was born then, so I think that was awesome. But yeah, and it's not. And so, and even if we do get to go back to the 80s, then cool. We planned for the worst and we got something better, but we have to recognize that our situation is really challenging, and that the reality is that the West is becoming more arid, hot and dry, and all the things, and so we have to make these hard decisions. And so again, that's something that I was excited that the CWCB is grabbing a hold of, and the new water plan really talks about aridification and steps away from drought to show that we're taking this reality very seriously. Anything to add?
I'd highlight again, I end up focusing in the Rio Grande because that's kind of home, and some of my constituents and folks that are trying to manage groundwater there. Again, I referenced it, it's called Subdistrict 1. There's about 170,000 irrigated acres, groundwater irrigated acres there, that really has been faced with this dwindling supply for 20 years. And they're on the cusp of really what might be considered by some as a pretty draconian effort to save their system and their community at some expense. But for perspective, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole of sub-districts and how we do this, but for perspective, it cost a producer, when we started this effort in 2012, it cost a producer $45 an acre foot to pump an acre foot of water out of the ground that they didn't recharge water into the system, so a net pumping fee. Then it went to $75, then it went to $90. The last 2 years it's been at $150. And for perspective, again, in recognition that the system isn't responding well, and really what we're doing is taking out more than that's flowing in. We're in the cusp of, and for 2 years now, discussing this rather draconian step that will push that effort to $500 an acre foot for a producer, for a farmer. And if it still doesn't work, the mechanism is there to push that even higher if we have to. And the whole idea is to try to get to a spot where we're only pumping water that we're actually putting into the system. And that's an absolute recognition that says we've tried this for a decade, and Mother Nature has not been very helpful at all. Again, we've cut 100,000 acre feet of pumping out of that system, but the aquifer is at nearly its lowest point ever. So people in my community, particularly in that group in Subdistrict 1, are certainly cognizant of, climate change and the aridification, and a recognition that if we don't act, even more aggressively now, that sense of urgency just continues to grow year after year. And we're really at this, again, really a kind of a nexus, a turning point for those constituents, and it's not going to be easy at all.
Or cheap.
No.
It's a supply-demand challenge. So what you're talking about with climate change is you've really blown up the supply side of the equation. I mean, it used to be you could rely on a bad year being followed at least, or a bad period being followed by a good hydrologic period. And that's not the case anymore. So we have to get smarter about how we manage both sides of that equation. The supply side, we've got to do more with groundwater in places like where you are right now. The Denver Basin sits right underneath our feet. We have to do a better job about how we manage water in that basin, how much we take it out, how much we take out, how much we recharge. And when we recharge down there, if we treat it like a reservoir, we don't lose it to evaporation, which is a climate change driven problem, because the warmer it is, the more your evaporation increases. So we've really got our work cut out for us, but we also, like I keep coming back to, we are at a period where we've got more data and we've got people talking to each other about their experiences than we've ever had, more connectivity than we've ever had. So if we were going to get faced with a challenge like this, that's as bad as it is, there's almost no better time for us to respond. And respond we must on the demand side. In addition to, let's not grow turf where the only thing that's touching it's a lawnmower. Let's also get smarter about how we use it in our homes. We have the ability, thanks to the legislature, to have gray water use. One of the senator's colleagues, Jenny Arndt, was instrumental in pushing through a regulation that allowed gray water use to happen inside homes. That takes your master bath shower water, treats it to a near drinking water quality standard, and then you flush your toilets with that water instead of with clean drinking water. It can reduce the amount of water that a home needs to bring in by 25%. That's a lot of water. Where we grow, what we grow, the grass we grow in the Colorado River Basin or with Colorado River Basin water is another place. How many, this is a question for my fellow panelists, I should have put it in the chat. But,
All right, he's going off script. Go ahead.
How
Short
many
question.
golf courses,
Short question.
How many golf courses do you think there are in Palm Springs?
Oh, I was just.
If you know, don't answer. You take a guess.
In Palm Springs?
Yeah.
I don't know. 20.
110. 110. And they built 8 this year. You don't have a house, a community, a development around that part of the basin without putting it around a golf course. They feel like the competition requires it. And it's not to throw a bunch of stones at the lower basin, because I completely agree with you guys that pointing fingers and blaming people doesn't get you anywhere in this business. What we have to do is try and figure out smarter, better ways to do the management side of the equation than we have in the past. Now, they use all groundwater for that, for those golf courses that they water. And they try and recharge. They try and get really sophisticated about how they recycle water. We're learning more and more about that all the time, and we've got to pick up the pace because it's just, we're getting run to ground by the challenge.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give us about 5 more minutes so you all can get back to drinking and a lot more food that's out there. We are not getting to all these wonderful questions, but guess what? Some of these are in the podcast. So hopefully they'll be addressed if you listen to the podcast. But I want to pick up on something you all said and kind of give you this opportunity to both talk with our audience, but think about how we communicate, because science and evidence-based decision-making, 100%. That's what we stand for, right? Like, how do we do that better? And yet we know that facts and data do not change minds. They do not change behavior. That is not what's going to win out in ultimately the day, right? So we need that for better decisions, but we also need the idea of communication and how do we connect with people. Story is often a great way to do that. So share with me some of those things when you think about those conversations that you have with people about this issue. What's resonating? And I'm actually pulling a question in here because people want to know, like, how do we think about these future generations of people who live in a city and their water comes from a tap, right? So again, this communication, this engagement, this education piece, I want all of you to think about that. And we've got 4 minutes, so we've got to have like 1 minute answers to this or so, okay? I don't think they can do it either. She dared you. Do you want to lead by example? No. Okay. Senator, why don't you start?
It's a tough question, and I mean, Heather and I talk about this quite often, but look, a lot of it, that's a lot of what motivated me to run for office, to be at the Senate, to be in the legislature and engage with those folks. I talk about there are 35 senators in the chamber. I think I'm the only one that owns a water right that uses it to produce food. I know there's at least one other one that owns one but leases it out to somebody else. So I took it upon myself to really start engaging with legislators there. I'm on the Interim Water Resources Review Committee and trying to get folks, again, to a better, and this comes with a little bit of cautionary, how much engagement and education do I want legislators to have in that water space? But I think the alternative is worse. So I'm engaged. I had Senator James Coleman, a wonderful friend of mine from Denver, come spend Memorial Day weekend with me at my house. We brought his family down. We had an amazing weekend with James and his family, and take him out to my farm and show him, how we flood irrigate. And I don't think James had Senator Coleman had a great appreciation for what flood irrigation was. And those kind of opportunities, that's really what, I felt like I'm compelled to be there to engage with folks and help them understand. Because again, the circumstances are just, the sense of urgency, I've said this a few times, just continues to grow. And trying to help folks, my fellow legislators and folks in urban settings get a higher appreciation for understanding, where your water comes from when you hit the tap.
Just echo that really briefly. The Gold Dome is the home of both chambers of our legislature, and they're both population-based districts. So if we're going to have legislators that know what they're talking about when it comes to water management and the other parts of the state where we grow our food, they need to listen to people like Senator Simpson, and thank goodness for the work that he's doing, independent of party. I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican, and it doesn't matter. We need that kind of expertise under the Gold Dome, and we need people in rural Colorado leaning into the cities where we're urbanizing quickly. The last census showed that. We've got to have more connectivity between the rural parts of the state, and that's what's beautiful about this audience and this venue, George, that you've put together here, is you put people from rural, there's buses outside all the time from rural districts that bring people in here and show our history, but also gives them the ability to access the city, the municipal urban environment, and we need that to be happening on the other wavelength, on the rural wavelength as well. So I think, this is the type of thing we need to see more of.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's about the storytelling. And you mentioned, that when you came to the Valley, you got such a warm welcome. And it's because people love to tell their story, and they want to show you around and, hear you laugh in a storage full of potatoes. And so I think we need more of exactly this. So well done. Maybe we should clap for Kristan for this awesome podcast and event, because this is really cool. But it's about the connections. It's about us continuing to reach out, continuing to make friends and tell our stories, and to continue to help people see that, if they live in Denver and they love to come down to the Sandless Valley and see the sandhill cranes or go to the Great Sand Dunes, they care about water in the Sandless Valley. And, you know, people in the San Luis Valley, I was stoked to come up here. I'm going to hang out for a day and, you know, do some errands and do some fun stuff in Denver. We're connected. And, you know, people in Denver go skiing on I-70. People in Steamboat go over to Durango. We're all one state. We're all one, you know, connected system, both through the plumbing, but also just from our statewide community. And so I think we have to all take opportunities to hear each other's stories, but to also keep telling them. So thank you.
Well said.
As you all can tell, podcasting is a beautiful art form. You can talk to people for hours. We have hundreds of hours of tape, and we narrowed it down to 2.5 hours for you to listen. But because of beautiful conversations and narrative, and you all are really great at getting some succinct, good sound bites in there, so thank you for that. A huge thank you for joining me this evening. It is an absolute pleasure to always spend some time with you. I appreciate the honesty. I appreciate you all dedicating your lives to this work and being very thoughtful in it. So thank you. A huge thank you, of course, to all of our other podcast guests here tonight, Brian and Jesus and Mindy and Emma. And George alluded to, we have many folks from last year's podcast, Coal at Sunset, here. And that was our first foray into trying to tell some of these hard stories about, for this, our energy transition. And felt very welcome in Moffat County as well. We're really grateful when that happens. And thank you to many people who made that possible. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you to our digital virtual audience. I know I never recognized you. But let's give a round of applause for our guests, and we'll go have some drinks. Thanks.